thank you everyone for tuning in to an episode where I'm back from streaming video games to talking about public transportation. What I'm going to talk about today is about the distinction between, I'm not sure what they're called, between forms of public transportation that are designed for social reasons, for like social services, and ones that are designed around ridership, sometimes around financial or commercial outcomes, but even if not, around getting very solid ridership. These are two different kinds of services. They're lumped together as both, let's say, mainline trains or as urban transit or whatever, but they're not. But they're fundamentally different. They have different goals. They have different designs. They don't usually work very well together. Usually they're not planned together, and often just lumping them together leads, first of all, to analytical errors, and second, to planning problems. So when I say social service transit, there's the European version, the American version. I actually want to talk about the American version first because it's much more glaring. So the American version is that, let's call it ridership transit, or a ridership that maybe does not have commercial goals but could have, is stuff like the New York City subway or the New York City commuter trains. Right? They're not very good, the commuter trains. They could be very heavily modernized, but these are things that could that could be better, that could get more ridership, could be much cheaper to operate, that are designed around at least some semblance of ridership-oriented goals, model split-oriented goals. The same, and it's not just New York. I mean, Boston has barely 1/3 the model split of New York, and I would say the same about its subway, its core buses, the light rail, even the commuter trains. And then you can compare that with, let's say, the suburban bus system in a secondary town. Let's call it New Haven. Let's say the New Haven buses. So New Haven has a train to New York. New Haven also has an internal bus system. Technically, they're both public transit. It is wrong to lump them together analytically. It is wrong to lump, let's say, the New Haven buses, even the Cleveland being a much larger city, with a ridership-oriented system. These are not general public transit. These are basically soup kitchens on wheels. Cleveland has 3 different urban rail lines. I think 2 of them are branches of one track, so I guess 2 or 2.5. Cleveland is still, like, even that, the Cleveland system is a soup kitchen on wheels. Worcester, again, New Haven, everything other than the top few cities in the United States is like that. And maybe they want to do better, but they're not doing better. You should never lump things where the average income is half that of a solo driver with a New York City subway when you do any kind of analysis. The goals are just different. The goal in a place like New Haven is transportation of last resort, leading to very meandering buses that we're going to look at hopefully later this video. And then and again, in Europe, in Europe we don't quite have that, because in Europe, thankfully, cities the size of a Cleveland, let alone in New Haven, could have a pretty strong urban rail network. An urban rail network that I want to say usually isn't profitable, but Metro Munich is the same size as Metro Cleveland. It's about 3 million people. Cleveland proper is much smaller. Munich is only now undergoing white flight, and the white flight is being replaced on a more than 1-to-1 basis with immigrants. And but I believe that the U-Bahn in Munich financially breaks even, or I guess did before Corona. The Berlin U-Bahn broke even financially before Corona. It no longer does. Corona led to a hit to ridership, and while the ridership has been restored, they also gutted the fares. It used to be 86 euros a month. Right now, then they made it. Then after the €9 ticket, they made it a €29 monthly ticket, and I think at this point it's 9 or 10, and then nearly all users are on the Deutschland ticket, which is €49, valid on all non-intercity trains within Germany. So that is it. So this is a service that does not really earn revenue, right? I mean, when you're selling a monthly ticket for €9, you're not earning any revenue. But it's a service that did before Corona and could. They made a social decision and a political decision to subsidize it, but it's still planned not that way. It's not planned as some kind of soup kitchen. It's planned as a citywide transportation network, which could charge fares that would lead to break even without being exclusive. 86 euros a month is not an onerous fare to pay. And again, they chose not to do it, but that's very different. But that's very different from the New Haven buses, where the fare, I don't remember what the fares are. I want to say it's maybe $1 or $1.50 per ride, and I don't know if they have season passes. So, yeah, cheaper than in Berlin. Or rather cheaper than Berlin before Corona, but not massively so. Lots of European cities did things like that. I think Vienna had its 365 euros a year, or still has this 365 euros a year ticket. But the ridership, and we're talking differences of orders of magnitude. And again, New Haven size regions of Germany, let alone Cleveland size ones, can have pretty solid transit networks. I mean, we all mock Bielefeld, saying that it doesn't exist. Bielefeld has tram lines. I mean, so I'm somewhat channeling Jared Walker on this. Yeah, exactly. So to Jared Walker, this is a distinction that is not between cities but within them. So for Jared Walker, there's a distinction within a city between lines that are designed around getting high ridership and lines that are designed for coverage. So New Haven, my example, has probably two main corridors that could generate ridership, which are Dixwell and Whitney. They are north-south. Dixwell, miraculously, is pretty closely parallel to a canal that was then turned into a branch railway called the Farmington Canal, which with a little bit of so it's this one is the right of way, and this is Dixwell. So this is something that actually could be rail served. I think there are 6,000 riders a day on this. This is by far number one. Number two is a near tie between a bunch, but I think the one that's most solid is Whitney, which goes Union Station and then north on Whitney into inner suburbia. But nearly everything, but even those are treated as coverage sources, and we are going to get back to that in a bit. And I would argue that the 49 euro ticket, the Deutschland ticket, is essentially a surrender on the same within the context of regional rail in Germany. And by the way, A+ obscure secondary city knowledge. Martha, New Haven is the number 2 city that I've, in amount of time that I've spent in it, that without having ever lived there, behind Boston, and it was number 1 until a couple years ago. I have family there. So New Haven is not a randomly chosen city. Anyway, so within Germany, again, nothing like the New Haven bus network really exists here at anything of that scale. Bielefeld has a bunch of tram lines. So they've actually tried to do better integration of trams and buses there. I don't know if it's been successful, but it's something that they've been trying to do. So in Germany, and in general in Europe, it's mostly a distinction between, let's call it, metropolitan, regional, and intercity trains. So it's a three-way distinction. So the metropolitan lines are things like the U and S-Bahn in Berlin. Remember, the U-Bahn in Berlin financially broke even before Corona. I don't think that the S-Bahn did. Overall, the Verkehrsverbund, comprising the entirety of Berlin and Brandenburg, made 60, I believe about 2/3, so 67% of its expenses through fares, the fare box recovery ratio. I don't know the breakdown by mode. All I know is that the U-Bahn was about 100%. Maybe the S-Bahn within the city was also there, maybe not. I don't know how much of the expenses are within that are the core Berlin network, even the parts that go into the suburbs a bit, like S-Bahn lines that do go into Oranienburg or Potsdam or Straßberg, versus or the airport, versus I guess the airport did not exist before Corona, but the old one that it replaced did. Versus things like the buses in Cottbus, things like that, which are also in the same Verkehrsverbund, or the buses in Brandenburg an der Havel. And so let's call all of that Metropolitan Rail, even though I would argue that things like regional trains to Cottbus start getting into coverage pretty quickly. So that's Metropolitan. Again, Berlin is the largest single core city in Germany. It's one of the largest in Europe. I think in the Union it goes Paris, then Madrid, then Berlin, then Barcelona maybe. And because Milan is polycentric and its dominant center is smaller than Berlin, ditto Frankfurt. Amsterdam, nice city, but it's not very big. The bigness is a bunch of cities in one place. And so but it's the same thing again. It's the same thing in a place like München and even Stuttgart. Stuttgart's a bit smaller than München and has a weaker model split, sadly. And so that's the Metropolitan side, which again is on net mostly ridership oriented. Then there's the intercity network, which is also ridership oriented. Remember, it is illegal to subsidize intercity rail within the European Union because it's supposed to be competitive. The only way you're allowed to subsidize intercity rail is if you accept it from the overall system. So in Italy, there's a kind of passenger service obligation where they take a bunch of intercity lines that in Germany would have been demoted to regional lines precisely because they cannot profitably operate, and then they and then they have a supposedly open bid for who wants to run subsidized service on them, and then Trenitalia does this. I do not know to what extent it's really open or if it's just nobody else even cares. So that would be lines serving places like Ancona. Places that are not, this is specifically intercity lines that are not the Frecce, aka the high-speed line, the high-speed or high-speed adjacent lines in Italy. So yeah, these things can take subsidies, but these are peripheral to the network. The existence of a place like Rimini or Bari, that's not really going to feed the core profitable Frecce network, the one that goes from the north through Roma to Napoli. And then Deutsche Bahn Fernverkehr is profitable. SNCF is supposed to be, and the fact that it isn't is creating a lot of angst. Renfe, I think, broke even before Corona, or almost did. So it's normal for intercity services here to be profitable, and yeah, not every single line is. But usually they work as a system. From time to time, a line can slip in and win out, even though it's unprofitable just because of some kind of moralization. Maybe it's filling in something would look like a big gap in the map. In France, the example would be intercity. So yes, it does yield terrible service in Italy. But it exists. And again, in Germany it also exists. They're just called regional lines. Social service intercity lines exist in Europe. They're just uncommon. Yeah, there are these in Italy or the intercity in France, which are, I want to say, 5 or 10 million riders a year, and the TGV was 110 before Corona, and to my understanding has more than fully recovered. So these are things that might be kept because of big gaps in the LGV network. So here is the TGV network, and at this point, I've been using this computer enough that the Wikipedia articles that I most often look at on stream are already in the memory. So ignore the stuff that is said to be under construction. A lot of it is vaporware. And just look at the stuff that exists, that is to say not dashed. That is to say will look not dashed as soon as this actually opens. Why are you doing this to me right now, Twitch? Okay, thank you. No, I don't want you to be full screen. Just... What is wrong with it? Okay, better. So, trains from France go southeast to Lyon and Marseille, and they go southwest to Tours, which they don't quite serve. So if a train goes to Tours, it cannot continue onward. Tours is a terminal, and eventually they go to Bordeaux, and then at lower speed to Toulouse. And then in the middle, there's nothing. And there's nothing not just about infrastructure, it's also there just are not a lot of people. So trains to Clermont-Ferrand are intercity. They're not TGV. I guess there's not enough of a line from Lyon to Clermont-Ferrand that they could do a train that goes at high speed here and then low speed here. Instead, the train goes at low speed the entire way. There are 7 trains a day in each direction last I checked. I checked pretty recently, a couple months ago. I don't know anything about their finances, but I can guarantee you they're not making money on that. So, yeah, that is something that can exist because it fills in a real or perceived gap in the network. But it's small potatoes. Not actually that many people live in Auvergne. Auvergne was lumped in with Rhône-Alpes in the regional reform to give it more heft or something, or to lump it with something that has more heft. It's just, I mean, yeah, it's subsidies, but it's not important subsidies to the bottom line of SNCF. The fact that SNCF is not making money anymore is not about Clermont-Ferrand. So yeah, it persists. It's a little loss that is not terribly important in the grand scheme of things. But the regional lines as a network are essentially coverage service. And the reason I call them coverage service is, again, look at the population served. And this comes from something that was noted by a commenter on my blog, by Weifang Jiang, who I think is British. Judging by what he mentions, what he talks about, I think is Chinese British. I do not know what generation. But the way he talks completely British. So, and he points out that Berlin to Hamburg, yeah, is very heavily padded. The trains in Germany are padded about 25% on average, some less, some more, but so you take the technical travel time and you add 25%, and that's the scheduled travel time, lots of buffer time, lots of room for recovery. And he points out that this is because they're serving a dual purpose, because these lines don't just carry intercity trains, they also carry regional trains. One of the things that some rail advocates in Germany will point out, unfortunately not enough rail advocates, so it's not done, is that Germany could improve the reliability of its train service by building a dedicated high-speed rail network, which Germany does not have. Okay, I killed the TGV. So I'm going to bring it back because it does have a map of high-speed lines in Europe, this one. Okay, this will not tell me. Okay, this is not what I was expecting. So we're going to do the ICE instead. High-speed trains by countries, Germany. And yeah, okay, so this is the map. So only things that are red or orange are new or so heavily upgraded they might be new high-speed lines. And so every high-speed train has to share a lot of its route with slower trains that are often regional express trains and not just intercities. So it's not just, let's say, 200 kilometers an hour trains from Berlin to Leipzig, and then, yeah, sure, then some, it says go at 200 and then go at 300 up to here. No, there's also some regional trains. Regional trains that at this point are free with a Deutschland ticket. So even more subsidized. And Berlin-Hamburg is entirely on legacy track. So there are regional express trains here. And this does make the schedule more fragile because there are timed overtakes. And if the train misses its slot, then it delays other trains. And so the planning kind of assumes that these have to work together. And then the idea is that the regional express trains are really important because they serve places that are less urban and maybe they feed the network. In practice, let's look at populations for a moment, okay? So Berlin has, and all of this is of 2020, I guess, 3.7 million people, Hamburg 1.9. These lines pass through Brandenburg and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, so the states combine. So Mecklenburg-Vorpommern has fewer people than the city of Hamburg. Brandenburg has fewer people than the city of Berlin, but it's not really true that all of these intermediate stops on the regional express trains serve these states. They don't. I mean, the population centers of Brandenburg, first of all, some of it are just pure Berlin suburbs like Potsdam, Königs Wusterhausen, places like that. They don't necessarily just go northwest. And then the others, they're what, Neuruppin? No, I mean the main cities of Brandenburg that are not very tightly close to Berlin are Frankfurt an der Oder, Cottbus, and Brandenburg. And so that regional express doesn't really serve them. There are other regional express lines that serve them. There's the Berlin to Magdeburg line goes through Brandenburg. So yeah, sure. And likewise with Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern has cities. I mean, I can mock it for being smaller in population than just Hamburg. I can mock it for how it's how the governor of this state, Manuela Schwesig, is so tight with Russia that she may have engaged in corruption just to keep the Nord Stream 2 pipeline still going on. The pipelines would enter MV, and East Germany generally has pro-Russia politics, kind of the opposite of the parts of Eastern Europe that are closer to Russia. Like in the Baltic states, everyone hates Russia. In Poland, everyone hates Russia. And then East Germany is the most pro-Russian part of Western Europe. And so but anyway, this place does have cities. They're not between Berlin and Hamburg. They're not on the. I mean, maybe Schwerin is vaguely. It's not on the line between Berlin and Hamburg, but it's something that could, I guess, maybe feed it. But no, I mean the main cities are Rostock and Stralsund, and these are served north-south from Berlin. On separate regional express lines. So the point is that there's a kind of tail wagging the dog issue here where it's said to be really important to have these regional express trains between Berlin and Hamburg, but they don't serve very much. And this is a common thing that when you have both coverage and ridership transit, usually ridership will be where the ridership transit is, practically by definition. And the upshot is that if you're planning too much around regional trains first, then you will have inferior planning. In the case of Germany, it's that there is disinterest among rail advocates in building an intercity-only network of high-speed lines. So taking this and making there be a lot more red. To the extent that they build more, so this is the most recent line to have been built. And it's built for 250 and not 300, Stuttgart to Ulm, and it's being continued to Augsburg at 250, not 300. this is how trains are going to need to. This is how trains are getting between Paris and Munich, between Paris, Munich, and Vienna in the future, and they're making this slow. Because of various beliefs that either very high speed is literally immoral because something emissions. It's kind of weird because trains for the, but by the standards of other modes of travel, trains do not have carbon emissions. So you just want to make them as good as possible. So please 300. Maybe also something about costs and land takings. But again, compare how many people live in Stuttgart or even Ulm, and how many people live in between. Like it's way more people live here than in between. So in Germany, the disinterest in making it and having an all red network and just building a little bit more, maybe a bit more red. I think this is being built, or sorry, this is being planned. This is being planned. This is being planned. This blue here is the busiest line in Germany. They're doing this just because this, you can kind of see how it's not even blue, it's partly gray. So I think they're trying to either yellow or either orange or red this. Here there are lots of NIMBYs, but this should be red. So because they're not doing that, it means that the actually high ridership intercities. Germany is not quite France, where the intercities have, I'm forgetting whether 5 or 10 million riders a year, and the TGV has 110. But in Germany too, a very large majority of ridership on intercity lines is ICE. Now it's ICE that's where I don't think a single ICE run is entirely on high-speed lines, because the longest all high-speed connection between two major cities is this one, Frankfurt to Köln. This is longer, but try to see which cities are being connected. The largest of them is Hannover. So if you're doing anything, say if you're connecting anywhere more interesting than Hannover, so Hamburg to Frankfurt, blue, gray. You're trying to go to Nuremberg, gray. You're trying to go to München, gray. Yeah, some red, and then gray. And so so this line, yeah, it's long, but it's in effect incomplete. Try to imagine a video game, very complex one, like a very complex plot, and then there are, let's say, 5 chapters, and they made chapters 2 and 3 really well to like AAA standards and everything, and then chapters 1, 4, and 5 are playable, but they have stick figure graphics. And not even cute stick figure graphics where that's intentional. It's just placeholder with cubes. And yeah. The 49 euro ticket is this weird thing that is a lot like what exists in the United States, but on the local level. Which is, again, Germany does not have American problems at the local level. In Germany, at the local and regional level, everything is integrated. The problem is that right now, the slow trains, which are more expensive to operate because the rolling stock costs the same. Up until about 200 or 250 kilometers an hour. And then beyond that, at 300, it costs more, about twice as much. And even then, it costs less per kilometer because the average speed is that much higher. On all red lines, it could be averaging more than 200 kilometers an hour. Regional Express does not average even half it. It averages 60 or 70. When I took Regional Express trains with the free tickets last summer to Leipzig, this was about 160 kilometers. And it was almost 3 hours. There was a little bit of waiting, but not that much. So yeah, the average speed, not counting the wait time, would have been probably about 65 or 70. And the intercity, again, it's blue and not higher speed than that, but the regionals never get to that speed anyway. The regionals stop at 160. So the intercity, I think, does it in an hour 15, give or take. So averaging about 140. And yeah, this is, so even taking into account the high-speed trains are more expensive to purchase, the cost of the rolling stock amortized over trip length is actually less on a high-speed train. The cost of the crew is less because crew get paid by the hour. And because high-speed trains are more, they get more ridership, more people want to ride them, the trains are longer. One of the problems that we've had in Germany with with these free regional trains is the regional trains, because they're coverage transit, because their service is not designed around Berlin to Leipzig. The regional trains from Berlin to Leipzig are not about Berlin to Leipzig. That's what you're supposed to ride an intercity train for. They're about the intermediate points. They're about Wittenberg. They're about Dessau. Places I'm sure are perfectly cute, but not a lot of people live in a place like Dessau or Wittenberg. And when I was taking these free trains, nobody got off at the intermediate stops or almost nobody got off at the intermediate stops, except when that was the transfer point to the onward journey to another big city. So these are trains, so because the ridership generated by the Dessaus of Germany is not that much, or even the Magdeburgs is not that much, the trains are short. So more crew per train, because if you have a driver on a train that's about the size, that's, let's say, 4 cars of regional train length, about 75 meters, that's still... These trains might even have a conductor, I'm not sure. I don't think they do, but even a driver-only train still has a little bit more crew per train length than Ouigo TGV, because the Ouigo will have a driver and 4 conductors for the entire 16-car train. 16, I guess, measuring TGV car length is strange because these are bi-levels, but they're also shorter in terms of number of seats to one. So a little bit more, even more crew per length of train, and again, the average speed is about 1/3 as much. So so per train kilometer, you're paying the crew 3 times as much more. Yeah, these and the energy cost. These trains make a lot of stops where practically nobody gets on or off, but you still have to pay energy costs or acceleration. Yeah, the high-speed trains are actually more energy efficient. So, So it's a kind of a weird thing where the trains that are viewed as more corporate, viewed as maybe less cultured even, just because annoying people who vote CDU also ride them, rather than just starving artists or people who think they're starving artists. And again, I mean, remember, when the regionals are free and the intercities are not, these trains might as well run non-stop between Berlin and the connection point. The intermediate stops, basically nobody ever gets on or off, or almost nobody. So it's a weird whiplash of planning. Is this a social service or is this a ridership oriented service? Because if you're trying to get ridership, a lot of these regional trains might just not be run. It's pretty brutal, but you can make them free, and not a lot of people are going to ride them out of Dessau or Wittenberg. You might want to concentrate on things that maybe provide some kind of service to secondary cities where you could, in theory, get some ridership. So these are the Frankfurts, the Cottbuses, the Rostocks, the Stralsund. Where the hell is Stralsund? Here. The Schwerins, the Lübecks. But that is going to be a very different kind of paradigm. And again, the upshot is that these trains that are supposed to be kind of more lived in and are supposed to kind of feel cheaper to ride because you're not getting as good of a service, they are also more expensive to provide. And the attempt to lump them together does not result in good planning, nor does the fact that these regional trains would work better in a place like the Netherlands or Germany make them good planning. I mean, the Netherlands is a smaller and denser country. Switzerland is not denser than Germany. It's smaller. But the smallness also means that a lot of the regional trains are actually intercities. It's stuff like Zurich to Luzern. I mean, this is very short city to Luzern. I don't know what the rail length is. I'm guessing, let's say the trains would go via Zug. I don't actually remember if the trains go via Zug or not. Let's say they probably don't because Zug is. I don't actually know how they go, but it's what 40 something kilometers, maybe 50 if the line is a lot squigglier than I think it is. Yeah, 50 is not truly intercity, but it connects to different cities. It's a scale thing. Or Zurich to St. Gallen is, again, it's an intercity line for all intents and purposes. It's short, it's incredibly short, but it's still there. And the thing is, Berlin is a larger city than Zurich, which means that it is a larger economy than Zurich. I mean, obviously Zurich is a lot richer than Berlin. Per capita, Switzerland is richer than Germany. Per capita, also not per capita, West Germany is richer than East Germany. Berlin is not a very wealthy city, and yet 60 kilometers from Berlin, where we're Brandenburg an der Havel. Yeah, Brandenburg. I mean, if you follow the Japanese definition of metro area, Brandenburg is a suburb of Berlin. No, the Japanese definitions are very loose. So, by, let's say, French definitions or German definitions, the metro area of Tokyo is smaller than what it is by Japanese definitions. Not massively so, let's say. By the Japanese definition is what's 37 million, maybe. By the French or German one, maybe it's 32 or something like that, 33. But it's still, but Berlin is large enough to exert this kind of influence as far as Brandenburg, to the point that the Regionalexpress, they've recently redone it to have a 20-minute takt, I think, Berlin to Brandenburg, and I'm forgetting how far east. I'm forgetting whether as far as Frankfurt or less than that, because it's starting to become a suburban line. Zurich to St. Gallen or Zurich to Luzern is unthinkable. Zurich is small; it is too small for that. So this means that people use it differently. And so in Germany, there's this kind of belief that regional lines are more moral. Yeah, you can do. Is it fixable with more capacity? Sure, but why would you want more capacity on trains that are more expensive to provide and have inferior service? Okay, I mean if I'm insensitive to fares and I'm going to Leipzig, I'm going to go on the single seat ride where I get a seat and the train takes an hour 15, rather than the 2-seat ride where on net it's about 2 hours 50, and where it's 2 hours 50, and the last hour I have no chance of getting a seat because the going outbound, because the connection at Dessau was already full of people from Magdeburg. Why would I do that to myself? And yeah, maybe if you added more cars, then the part about seats would be fixed, but the part about speed would not be fixed. And the slower train, and so from the perspective of Deutsche Bahn, they want me to generate the most profit for them. But if the fares were the same, and they're not, but if they were the same, they would still want me on the faster trains because the faster trains are cheaper to provide. That's the thing that I think breaks a lot of people's brains. Where the superior, or let's call it the ridership service, is also cheaper to provide than the coverage service. Where the soup kitchen, I'm not going to call it a soup kitchen, but it's comparable in some sense to American lines that are soup kitchens. Sometimes it actually costs more to provide food at a soup kitchen for whatever reason than it is to just go to Aldi, or in America, I guess it would be a Walmart, and just buy the food yourself. Sometimes it's like that, and certainly in public transit. I mean, I don't know the food economics well enough to tell you whether what I just said is ever correct about institutional food, but it's certainly true about transportation. And so in Germany there's not much of an analytical error, I think, in terms of lumping them together, because the great majority of public transport is local rather than interregional or intercity, and at the local level, Germany doesn't really have soup kitchen transit. Or even France. France has more of that, but still very little. even in a place like the Riviera. So the Riviera is unusually soup kitchen-y because of rather atypical things. And I don't say, and not because France is atypical, but because the Riviera is atypical. So I'm describing to you something where Nice is genuinely different from Bordeaux or Toulouse. Bordeaux and Toulouse have light rail and light metro networks, respectively, that are centered around. I think both of them are triangles around city center. Maybe there's a fourth line. I think maybe there's a fourth line under construction in Toulouse, where they're mostly, or because of the shape of the network, it connects to all city center jobs, and these tend to be higher income. So public transit demographics are always an interplay between the fact that richer people are likelier to own a car, but richer people are also likely to be working in city center, and public transportation works the best connecting to places where lots of people want to go when lots of people want to go. For example, remember in the United States, Los Angeles, the epitome of car culture, has in downtown LA, and all of this is pre-corona numbers, a 50% model split among people who work in downtown LA. It's just that downtown LA is very weak. And in the Riviera, this relationship kind of breaks down. First of all, because the Riviera, atypically for France, has a lot of its jobs in a specific place, which is only accessible by car, which is called Sophia Antipoli. Which is not even in the city it's named after, which is Antibes. It's called Antipoli because it is the Latin name of Antibes, but it's not even in Antibes. It's in I don't remember the name of the commune, but it's in a suburb of Antibes. It's this area. It is, as you might be able to tell by the land use, total job sprawl, inaccessible by anything else, with a golf course like it's America, and another golf course like it's America. It's a place with a lot of non-working wealth, like a lot of retirees who like the sun, a lot of inherited wealth, a lot of Russian oligarchs in Monaco. Not as much working wealth. Again, a lot of the working wealth ends up being here rather than in the city center of Nice, which is where you would expect the most transit model split. So the result is that a lot of the public transport in this entire area is rather working class. I would not call it a soup kitchen. It's not at all a soup kitchen. It's maybe more I don't know what to call it. Maybe McDonald's, but McDonald's connotes a certain scale that I don't think is true here. This is a place where the model split is about 13%. So again, basically the same as in every other French secondary city that's not Lyon. It's just, I think, has a poor ridership profile. Lots of service workers in Monaco actually take the train, or maybe they take a bus. So again, it's not, I would not call it a coverage service, not when they have that kind of model split, not when they can support half-hourly frequencies off-peak, or at least could in the 2010s. I think they were actually investing in more than that. And so this may be, again, it's a ridership-oriented service. It's just because of things like Sophia Antipoli or how the city center economy is so atypically tourism, that if we're analogizing an American meandering bus that runs hourly to a soup kitchen, this should be analogized, again, not to McDonald's because McDonald's has more scale, but to think of some kind of food chain that is making money, which this doesn't because of a social decision to subsidize, but something that I guess could make money if they really wanted to. That is, or if they work on getting the TER operating costs under control. I think the TERs have conductors, and so a chain that's very downscale, but still like a private chain as opposed to something that tries to be a kind of charity. What are the jobs in Antipoli? I have no idea. I don't actually know what the industry mix is. It might just be generic. France does not really have specialization the way we think about it from Germany or the United States. Paris does everything. Paris's economic existence is the capital of France. It's not like there are specific. I mean, I guess maybe professional services are likelier to be in Paris than the rest of the country, and then maybe in the Riviera they're likely to be in Sophia Antipolis, or Nice, or the center of Nice than anywhere else. But there's no sense that one place is the film cluster, or one place is the chemicals cluster, or one place is the car cluster. The only thing they think is especially notable is that Airbus is in Toulouse. So I think that's the main exception to the relative lack of overt specialization in the French economy. So I can't think of a good German example of this, because I think at this point every major German metro area I could name at least some specialized industry there, because in Munich it's cars, and also Siemens is there. Stuttgart is cars. Is also cars. Berlin is the weird one because it's the capital of Germany, but it has a lot of tech nowadays. A lot of the tech startups are here and not in richer cities. I think it's because Berlin is atypically Anglophone. Frankfurt is finance and a bunch of conglomerates. Hamburg is publishing. Rhine-Ruhr is the kind of the generation of industry, let's call it, before the cars. Köln might actually be the major city in Germany where least likely to be able to name to you an economic specialization. Mannheim is chemicals. BASF is headquartered in Ludwigshafen. I forget actually where they're headquartered or just their largest factories in Ludwigshafen. France doesn't work like this. In the United States, the example that Paul Krugman gave in his Nobel lecture was, what exactly does Atlanta do? But anyway, yeah, it's still a very job-sprawly area. But even then, I mean, in France, there's the same kind of tripartite distinction where the metro systems, they're not making money, they're not aiming to make money. If they really wanted to, they could. So that would be, so not just the metro in Paris, but also the ones in smaller cities like Lyon, Lille, whatever, the light rail lines in Strasbourg, Bordeaux, Nice, maybe even the core TER lines. I mean, I'm not actually sure that I would class a line like Marseille to Aix or the core lines that we were talking about when I was before I went to do video games. When I was talking about Rhône-Alpes and PACA and their TER systems, I was talking about some pretty urban lines. I was talking about Ventimiglia to Nice to Cannes. This is not that much of a distance, right? I mean, Cannes to Nice is 30, and then Nice to Menton is 20, Nice to Ventimiglia is 25. I mean, it's not. I mean, it's a squiggly line because it mostly follows the coast. But that's squiggly. Yeah, so this is about 30 something each direction. So out of Nice, which is by far the most important center. Never to being Monaco. And so so this is something again where they're already investing in making it higher frequency, and so that is something where lines could actually change classification in the same way that every railway basically was built with the intention of some kind of profit. Because the historic railways were built by mostly by private companies that were making money off of them in the 19th century, maybe very beginning of 20th. Sometimes they weren't, maybe they were overexpanding, and it was pretty common in the United States especially. Maybe they were just not making as much money as they wanted to. It was very common in the UK. Maybe it was nationalized, but for example, Prussia had early nationalized railways, but they were making money. The Prussian state railways were making money. So then over time, changes in the nature of economic geography meant that connections to what at the time seemed like bustling industrial towns of 50,000 are now, I mean, nobody ever says bustling town of 50,000 unironically, in a rich country anymore, that's unthinkable. A metro area of 500,000 usually does not get the adjective bustling next to it. Dresden is about 1 million, Leipzig maybe a bit more. And yeah, you can describe their city centers as bustling, maybe, but that would be practically a Safar saying, I'm going to East Germany and I've got to tell you, Leipzig is not as bad as you think. So again, changes in the economy mean that, or in economic geography, mean that lines at the scale of Cottbus live off of whether they're commuter lines to big cities, which this one could be, or this one, especially, or this one. So some of the weaker lines are things that used to be, let's call them ridership services, and then became covered services. And in the same way, lines can reclassify in the opposite direction. So about attendant economic benefits, essentially yes. Political grounds, it's not. So political grounds can be subsidies to another place. So that would be when it's considered moral in Germany to subsidize the East, to the point that people make excuses for ill behavior in the East. For example, voting AfD. When Westerners do this, let's say, do some kind of rioting, people immediately talk about law and order. Or in France, it's considered moral to subsidize the provinces. In Britain, it's considered moral to subsidize the North, and Borners would remind us it also is considered moral in some but not all quarters to subsidize Scotland and Wales. Likewise, within each region, it's considered moral to subsidize its periphery always and not the core. So this can be external subsidies. In this case, it would be national subsidies. So there would be the passenger service obligations in Italy to peripheral places. If they were not peripheral, they would not need the subsidies because trains from Milano to Torino or from Milano to Firenze or Roma or Napoli make money. Thank you very much. There's a competing private operator because these trains make money. But these can also be internal subsidies. So that would be a place that's not subsidizing a part of itself, which is what happens under a Verkehrsverbund for all intents and purposes. But when you subsidize the service, just in general, and this happens with a lot of TERs. So in France, the tripartite distinction of Germany is the same thing. Metros and light rail are ridership services. The TGV is a ridership service. Thank you very much. And then it's stuff like the TERs, or at least most of them, that are covered services. And these can also be internal subsidies. What I mean by external subsidy, that would be the intercities that do exist to places like Clermont-Ferrand. These are external subsidies, money generated from things like from Paris to Lyon or Paris to Marseille, Paris to Bordeaux, Paris to Lille, gets seeded. I won't say get seeded to Paris to Clermont-Ferrand, but most of the losses of the makes money. Most of the losses of SNCF don't come from this. They come from maintenance costs on very lightly used lines, a lot more lightly used than this one, or on paying the train drivers disproportionately to their productivity. Essentially, French train driver salaries increase to match social willingness to subsidize services. Not for nothing, in Toronto in the 1960s, they had a clause that prohibited subsidies, prohibited subsidies to operations, because at the time it was still considered possible to run public transit profitably. And the Toronto Transit Commission supported that clause because that was their ammunition against strikes. So they could say, no, you cannot strike and get more money because we cannot afford that. It was essentially changing the horizon of when extra money would go not to service but to higher salaries, and by the 70s it became untenable, and that's when they started getting subsidized. And even then, it was a ridership service. Um, so again, you can turn a coverage service into a ridership service, and this leads a lot of people to moralize coverage services as things that could be ridership services, but sometimes it's just not happening. It could be in maybe a growing region, or in a region where a metro area keeps growing, and that exerts more influence and turns more lines into long-range commuter lines for itself. That would be again Berlin to Brandenburg. I think it's also the case in the Riviera, because growth in Packard has healthy population growth. The cities, so southern France used to have three centers, which were Bordeaux, Toulouse, and Marseille, and they were about equal size. And Barcelona was also about the same size as each of them 200 plus years ago. And then France just did not have a lot of population growth in the 19th century, and it did have a lot of urbanization, but not necessarily in the south. So, and Barcelona maintained more independence. So at this point, Barcelona's metro area is the same size as Bordeaux plus Toulouse plus Marseille. I think plus maybe Avignon and Toulon or something like that. But Marseille is at this point noticeably larger than these two. Marseille's had more recent growth. Provence is a little bit sunbelty that way, so that can turn that creates more commuting, and it's also and Nice is also pretty rich. I think Alpes-Maritimes. I don't remember the order, but Alpes-Maritimes, so Nice, and Brin, that is to say Strasbourg, are the two richest departments outside Ile-de-France. And so that creates more demand for commuting, and that can let them invest in the TER between Ventimiglia and Caen. And so anyway, that's the European side of it, and the American side is very different, because the United States basically does not have regional trains. And they don't mean it in the sense that in American activist language, they say commuter rail to mean a service that does not exist outside North America and maybe China. And China is doing it because it thinks it's imitating Europe. It's actually imitating North America with the Beijing commuter lines. And I say China, you think, oh, China is a big thing. Yeah, China's commuter lines are all a joke. I mean, the high rail ridership in China is high-speed rail, some intercity lines that are not high-speed rail, and metros. China is a country of suburban metros. They're not really a country of commuter rail. So no, Americans say commuter rail, and I mean service that's mostly for suburban rush hour commuters to city center, and then they call everything else regional rail. So for Americans, a train like the Berlin S-Bahn, which barely leaves city limits, practically, I think maybe 3/4 of the length of the Berlin S-Bahn is within city limits. Much more than 3/4 of the ridership is within city limits. So a train where the main usage is to go between, I don't know, Lichtenberg and Mitte. So let's say from Lichtenberg, so a train where the main use case is going from here, or let's even go one step farther. Let's say the main use case is to go at this distance, 7 kilometers, or maybe to Friedrichstrasse, it's what, 9? Or maybe north-south, or maybe the Wannsee-Bahn, so yeah, that's a little bit longer. It's called regional rail, and the same is true of the trains from Berlin to Brandenburg. So the Americans just don't have a distinction between regional trains that are more between basically interregional trains or proper regional trains, usually running hourly, maybe half hourly, and urban trains that are mainline trains. So they call them all regional rail in America. But separately, there's nothing like what we would call Regionalbahn in the United States, with the exception of a handful of lines, like New Haven to Hartford, maybe, or New York to New Haven, arguably, is that, with the commuter overlay. And And of course, everything that's within the commute distance of New York is never going to be a coverage service. That's ridiculous. Because a city this size does generate demand as far as New Haven. New Haven is 100 and... One of these days I will remember, I believe it's 117 rail kilometers, Penn Station to New Haven. And so the situation in the United States is within metropolitan areas sometimes, or just between them, but not the sense of connections between them, the distinctions between different metro areas. And then you look at cards that talk about the average cost of running public transportation in the United States, and they have this thing where the New York City subway is called public transit, and so are the buses in Sioux City. Sioux City is the tri-point, is this one. It's a tri-point between Iowa, South Dakota, and Nebraska. The buses, I think one bus goes into Nebraska, and another goes to South Dakota. This is a place I've never been to. It's just something that a couple years ago, a bunch of us on Transit Twitter decided to do a bus redesign by Twitter. And if you look at the buses in Sioux City, they run hourly. They don't need to. On the same resources, they could run half hourly, but they run hourly. They're incredibly meandering. It's transportation of last resort. That's why I call it a soup kitchen. So the point is, so the starting point is that I don't remember where, somewhere in downtown Sioux City, which if you zoom in, you can see it might actually be majority parking lot by area. There are some buildings there are some individual blocks that are not, but clearly this building, nope, this is parking. So, this block is about half of it is parking, half of it is buildings, parking. So anyway, but there's still stuff here that's not just parking, even if by area it looks like it's mostly parking. So somewhere around here is the bus. Is the bus connection point. Like most small cities in America, the system is that there are a bunch of buses, all of which go between one point in city center and somewhere else. They run hourly and they all pulse. So there's a timed transfer across all of them. So lots of time transfers, except that these are buses that are on hourly and are take about three times as long as driving. So for example, so what does it mean? So if it runs hourly, it means that the bus has 28-ish minutes to get between city center and its outlying destination. This is not a place with a lot of traffic. 28 minutes is, I don't know, 20 kilometers even, maybe a bit less, maybe 15. This is 15 kilometers out of Sioux City. Yeah, the buses don't go that far. They don't need to. They go, I don't even know if they go into Dakota City. I think they go down to about here. And somehow they do the circuit in an hour because they meandered into literally everything. For example, this is the Walmart Supercenter. Yeah, they don't stop. So first of all, they can't serve both this and this as separate routes. I mean, they can, they just don't think that way. So the bus somehow, I think there's a weird one-way loop-de-loop where one way it goes here, the other way it goes here, and then here it doesn't stop here and tell people to cross the street because it's not a very crossable street. And they're not even going to put an overpass, so instead the bus meanders off of the highway into the supercenter. And then I think it meanders into this cluster as well. So it's a bus that's not really designed around use by anyone who has any other option. Because if you have literally any other option, why would you do that to yourself? Why would you get on a bus that's hourly, which again means something like 20 7 minutes one way from city center to the end, and maybe it's 15 or 20 when it's not to the end, to somewhere in the middle, when it's 3 kilometers. I mean, you can jog. I mean, 3 kilometers in 20 minutes, it's something you can jog. I mean, you probably would not want to jog on this highway, but it's something you can jog. You can bike it, and I mean, if these were streets that could be biked on safely, but a bike would do it in probably about 12, maybe 15, because it's not straight. So yeah, you would probably be biking this in about 15ish minutes. Why would you do it on if the bus takes 25? And the bus is hourly. The bus does not need to meet non-motorized travel time. It needs to do a lot better to take into account the fact that it comes on a schedule. And so this is not even something like McDonald's, but much smaller. This is a soup kitchen. And it's a very expensive soup kitchen because there aren't a lot of passengers. And so sometimes, I don't know if Subsidy does this, a bunch of American cities, instead of full-size buses, they have vans because, I mean, they're never getting more than 9 passengers on one vehicle, so why buy the more expensive one? But the bus driver still has to get paid. So these are massive subsidies per passenger. I mean, objectively speaking, it's not a lot of subsidies because there just are not a lot of passengers. I mean, if the model split is 1%, you're just not subsidizing that many people. And yeah, there are American metropolitan areas with 1% model split. I don't remember those cities, but there are larger ones. There are literally 1%. I think Detroit is maybe 1.5%. And yeah, and so and then you have these, but they're regulated as if they're public transit. So you have these National Transit Database statistics where the New York City subway is lumped in with the buses in Sioux City. And yeah, I mean, obviously way more people ride in New York than in Sioux City. If you lumped them together, Sioux City would just be invisible. But there are a lot of Sioux cities in America. New York City, Metropolitan New York is about 40% of American transit commuting. Maybe a bit more of all transit ridership, not just commuting. The secondary transit cities, so these are things like in just the America, it's Chicago, the Bay Area, Washington. I said Chicago, the Bay Area, Washington, Boston, Philadelphia, Seattle, and Honolulu. I think combined they're another maybe 20-25%. The question is, do you include things like LA and Atlanta, where there is a subway system but not much ridership? I mean, in LA I think LA might be the number 2 or towards number 3 agency in the US in ridership because LA is huge. But I mean, that's still not a lot of people relative to its size. And so, I think actually LA is number 3. And so when you do that, yeah, sure, you can get to maybe 75%, or 80%. Then the rest is the coverage lines. And yeah, the coverage lines are only maybe 20% of American transit ridership, but the New York City subway maybe would get a subsidy of, I don't know, 50 cents per trip or something like that, or $1 a trip. The commuter rail gets more because it's for richer people, and so the fares are higher, and the subsidy per person is proportionately higher, and also it's people who are considered important, and therefore nobody asks. I mean, not nobody. I mean, people ask questions like, "Are the workers exploiting us by doing pension cheating?" Big thing on the LIRR, but it's not moralized as the riders are undeserving the way it is when it's in inner cities. And so between that and the fact that the subsidies per rider on the 25, let's say the 25% or 30% most coverage systems in the US, they can be $5 a ride. I think that I can actually, let me actually check this. The NTD top 50 agencies, and we're still going to do 2019 because numbers from Corona and even from 2023 are going to be kind of garbo. So let's check Houston. So Houston, first of all, has a fare box recovery ratio of, what is this? 57 would be 10%. This is 8 million more. Yeah, it's 11.5% fare box recovery. It's entirely possible it costs more to collect the fares in Houston than the fares bring in. Fare collection costs, I think the credit card processing fees, when you have bulk discounts, it's something like 4%, all considered. I've heard of small agencies in the United States. Maybe Houston is big enough that it is not that high, but I've heard of some Bay Area agencies that are 15%. The MTA claims to be 15%. I do not know what it includes. If it might include the cost of all conductors on commuter rail, and then okay, just get rid of them. That's not the cost of fare collection. That's the cost of stupid operations for the 30s. But anyway, look. So the operating expenses are 574. How many riders do they have? Unlinked is 90 million, which means that if people are changing between two buses or a bus and a train, which is pretty common in Houston. Houston is a transfer-based grid at this point. Then they're double counted. If you single count them, if you double count them, which you shouldn't, you should single count them. Then subsidy is on the order of $4.50. No, not $4.50. $5.50 per rider per trip, and if you count them properly, it's 5 or 6%. And 6%, $5 or $6 per rider. This is Houston. Houston is not a small city. Houston is not a small city. I mean, there are in Europe 3 metro areas that are clearly larger than it. In, let's say, Central, Inner Eastern, and Western Europe, which are London, Paris, and the Rhine world. Istanbul is bigger. Moskva is bigger. But let's call it the EU plus. So EU plus places that were recently in the EU or places where it's plausible that they would be in the EU, like Ukraine. It's London, Paris, and the Rhine. This is how big Houston is. This is how big Dallas is. Dallas is same thing, 500 million in subsidies. So this looks like a 12% fare box recovery, and that gets split across 70 million. So yeah, $7 per trip. The thing is, when you lump this with New York, suddenly the subsidy, when you lump a lot of these with New York, the subsidies look pretty extensive. So people talk about how about things, Christoph. So in Houston, the grid did get better, and yeah, this was Christoph Spieler pushing that, and then Jarrett Walker doing the design. The ridership increase was there. It was not huge, as I understand it. The problem is Houston is doing a lot of shit is its problem. And remember, Houston is a very rapidly growing metro area. When you have rapid growth, if you don't touch the infrastructure, I don't mean if you build freeways, I mean if you don't touch the infrastructure, you will have adverse model split, because you'll have a lot of congestion in city center, and so jobs will just yeet themselves out of city center and put themselves in the suburbs. When you don't build, if you choose to build freeways, yeah, you will get adverse model split. If you choose to build mainly mass transit, you will in a place that's not very rich, conserve high model split, as people who cannot afford the car get converted into people who can but choose not to. Let's call this place South Korea. And in a place that's already wealthy, you could get some model split, some model shift. Let's call this place Vancouver. But if you build neither trains nor motorways, you will get adverse model shift in a growing region, because cars are a consumer item. If you don't invest in capital goods, then there will be more disposable income to spend on consumer goods, like cars, and the congestion will lead to decentralization of jobs, to deurbanization of job geography. So Houston needs to build a lot more light rail, and the part where they tried to get clever about sequencing and then didn't build the universities line, and at this point are talking about making it a bus instead. Yeah, no. So that is the problem in Houston. It's something. I mean, they were trying to save things with the bus redesign, but the bus redesign, as I understand it, led to a little bit of a ridership increase, but it's not by itself enough. I mean, then you need. I think Jarrett keeps saying that these things are would increase ridership 20%. Houston has a model. I mean, Houston. So this is Dallas. No, Houston. Dallas is 70 million. That's in the metro area of about 8 million people. Houston is in the metro area of about 7 or 7.5. So there, the 90 million is about 12 per capita, and again, some of them are double counted. So it's probably more like 9 or 10 per capita. Berlin, on the widest definition of the metro area, is about 200. New York is, again, wide definition of a metro area, so the combined statistical area. Rail ridership alone, so I'm not even lumping in buses. In Berlin, rail alone is about 200 per capita. In New York, it's about 90. All of this per corona numbers. So anyway, So Houston. So even in Houston, I think it's mostly soup kitchen, where they're desperately and unfortunately unsuccessfully trying to convert it into something more. LA has the same issue. LA has such a soup kitchen a transit network that it leads to some really weird effects. So in New York and in San Francisco, gentrification raises transit ridership. Now, I'm going to tell you what the reference is, and I'm not going to show it to you. And the reason I'm not going to show it to you is that I'm going to try, and when it doesn't work, I will just verbally tell you what the pattern is that you can verify you could get right. Ridership, subway, New York. I'm going to click 2010 and hope that I got by station. Nope. Yeah. By station year. I really hope that this tells me the ridership at each station. So the thing to note, and I don't think I can find this. There used to be an applet that would have data viz of every. It would have data viz of every station since its opening, and I cannot find it anymore. Let's see if this. Oh, maybe map was good. Okay, so this is just snapshot 75 and 15, but the pattern is that in so it's specifically the pattern on the L train, which is one of the places where there's gentrification in New York. Not every neighbor in New York is gentrifying. For example, I don't think there's any gentrification in the Bronx. So gentrification usually builds itself from some kind of adjacency to something that's already middle class. So as an example of a place that is gentrifying, the Upper West Side was not considered a respectable middle class neighborhood in the 1950s. It gentrified around then. Partly was that the population itself became viewed as more respectable. In 1950, the Jewish population of the Upper West Side is viewed as, I won't say the least white people, but let's call them the least white non-Hispanic white people. Legally, Hispanics in America are white. By the 1960s, even, it was different. My favorite example on this is the book Catch-22, where Joseph Heller based Yossarian on his own Jewish experience in World War II. He started writing the book in 1953. He published in 1961, and in the version that I read, he wrote an introduction that talked about the background, and he mentioned that at the beginning, the main character was to be a Jewish American soldier. However, in 53, even it still could be some kind of convey some kind of outsider perspective. But by even the late 50s, Jews had assimilated so fast that he could no longer do that, and this is why Yossarian has a very weird background that people keep puzzling over where he's from. They say he's Assyrian. I think the name Yossarian is actually Armenian. And yeah, Armenians. I'm not going to say they are the least white non-Hispanic whites in the United States. I can see an argument in which they're the least white non-Hispanic non-Muslim whites. But he had to go there. And the Upper West Side is a very Jewish neighborhood. So part of that partly was population exchange. The point of gentrification is displacement did not exist at the time. It was white ethnics assimilating. So Jews here, Greeks here, Poles here. So, but it needs a place to build itself out of. And then more recently, when gentrification has had displacement, people who are connected with the Upper West Side keep moving up. So the boundary of the Upper West Side keeps moving up into Manhattan Valley, merging into Morningside Heights, which already has Columbia, going into Manhattanville, Hamilton Heights, even Washington Heights a little bit. And so, but the thing that I would like to point out is gentrification across along the L. Is in that I don't know if this file will have the pattern, but so here, so I don't know whether the increase in Williamsburg ridership in the 70s, early 80s counts. I think the gentrification is much later, but we see mostly declines in ridership along the L. And then second half of 80s, beginning of 90s, this is up, these are down. Orange and brown are down. Purple is basically flat. I guess purple is flattened up, brown is flattened down. This is where I think ridership might already be starting to rise. And then going up to 2004, that's where we're seeing massive ridership increases. It's everywhere, but the largest increases, you can see them on the L, and this is just gentrification building itself out of the L. So this is a pattern. In New York City, a neighborhood that gentrifies, it becomes wealthier, and that does lead to, and this increase is kept through. The L has had a lot of ridership increase, had a lot of ridership increase between the 90s and the 2010s. Okay, this is a little weird that they have percent of ridership change. Maybe I don't know. But the point is that in New York, the work in city center effect trumps the income effect. I think it's also true in San Francisco, in the Bay Area. In LA, it doesn't. In LA, gentrification reduces transit ridership because it replaces transit-dependent riders with people who can afford cars, and then they buy cars, the people who can afford cars. This is LA. Yeah, maybe some of them work in downtown LA and would take the train, but that's not enough people. And so, in LA, even if we don't analogize it to a soup kitchen, but to the same thing we analogize Terra El Pacato, so something that, and remember, model split in Alpes Maritimes is maybe 13%. Model split in LA plus Orange counties is 5%. You include the Inland Empire, it's about 3.5 or 4. I think 4. And so in LA, even if we analogize it to a big chain that is down to a big downscale chain, it's a chain that as soon as people get any kind of money, they stop eating it. Not even I remember having eaten that and now I still like it. So the chain's own customer base grows wealthier over time, and the chain upgrades itself, which is something that could happen. The private sector actors do sometimes change their brands in response to taste change. Like maybe if you're selling, I don't know, to a very Jewish clientele, then as Jews in the United States get wealthier between, let's say, the 1930s and the 1960s, you will yourself become more upscale. And people also perceive you maybe as more upscale as you're selling to an ethnic group that's no longer viewed as scans, or Italian Americans, same thing. Over honestly the same period of time. This is not what's happening in LA, at least not yet. And so analytically, the analytical errors, people talk about the average subsidy to public transit, and they look crazy because they lump the soup kitchens with the restaurants that take some subsidies but could be profitable if they wanted to. And so this is mostly used by anti-transit trolls, but not just. It also leads to, as I said, planning errors. So the analytical error is people saying, oh, look how subsidized public transit is. The planning error is that people then, it's kind of weird that it might be even the opposite planning error from Germany. In Germany, the planning error is that people keep trying to fuck a chicken that they shouldn't, which is moralizing about how nice things like regional trains are because you get slow transit. There are actual movements like slow transit that view speed as something that's only for cars and motorways, and the more moral way to travel is to enjoy scenery, often on a bike. And I don't want to enjoy, I mean, it's a nice scenery. I like looking at wind turbines, but actually probably not forests. For forests are not very nice to look at from a train. Walking through them is nicer. It's nice having scenery, but ultimately I want to get to Munich faster. I want to get to Köln faster. I want to get to Hamburg faster. Or once I want to get to Frankfurt faster, but I don't care about Frankfurt. I want to be able to get to Paris faster. It would be really nice if the train trip times from here to Frankfurt and from Frankfurt to Paris were such that I could actually go there for a weekend, but I can't. That is so. Now, I'm not going to fly to Paris, but other people would. And so the analytical error in Germany is they're trying too much to make something happen out of these regional trains. And that then delays the intercities. And what have they done? They made these regional trains, which are really expensive to run, in which muck tracks. There are maybe there are only 2 tracks on the line. The intercities are the bulk of the traffic, but they're still slowing them down to interact with the regionals. And again, that's Berlin-Hamburg. And in the United States, it's kind of oddly the opposite, because the problem is not between cities, because again, the United States does not have regional rail the way it's understood in France or Germany. The lines that activists want to upgrade to regional rail standards, things like sector regional rail, which I think is where the terminology comes from, or commuter lines in Boston or maybe New York. These are not ever regional rail the way it's called Regionalbahn here. These are supposed to be S-Bahn lines. And so maybe they go far enough out that there might be some comparison of, let's say, again, New York, New Haven, Boston, Providence, things like that. But mostly they're not that. Rather, the soup kitchens are buses within cities that are either decentralized or small. Yes, you took regional trains from Berlin to Düsseldorf. Yeah, this is the North German plain. This is the place with the least amount of scenery in Germany. In Saxony, there's more scenery. You can see nice. You can see very nice, like rolling terrain up Saxon, Switzerland. If you don't see any people, this is the best, because the people of Saxony are pretty fascist. And to be clear, I'm not stereotyping all of East Germany. I'm stereotyping Saxony and Thuringia. Brandenburg is pretty nuts, but it's saner. More west than east, like more West Brandenburg than East Brandenburg. I have no idea why. Eastern Partners, where the people complain about seeing black people on trains from Poland. I wish I were kidding. And yeah, so no, and no, I think the best scenario is if you do hiking or biking, but that's not transportation. I mean, if I'm hiking, that's the activity. And I think a lot of people don't get that, especially with bikes, where they conflate biking as transport with biking as an activity. So yeah, it's nice to bike as an activity. It's nice to walk, to hike as an activity. I found a forest on the margin of on the border between the eastern border of Berlin with Brandenburg. It was nice to walk through. It was less nice walking back on roads in Brandenburg that did not have sidewalks. That was not the activity. The activity was walking through the forest. But that is very different from walking as a commute, right? If I live close enough to work, if I don't work from home and I live to a place that, and if let's say when I worked in Stockholm and I lived in Stockholm, or 3 out of the 5 years I was in grad school, or when I was working in Providence, and that's a commute. That's the purpose of the trip is to get to the university, it's not to walk. The walking is the way I get there, and the hike is the purpose of the trip. It's a very big difference. And and so in the United States, the issue is that the secondary cities in a region will have soup kitchen buses. Sometimes it's even worse, because the soup kitchen, I'm deliberately using that expression because it is a kind of charity service that, because I'm talking so much about the United States, a lot of words that refer to various kinds of welfare or charity, and this includes the word welfare, are racialized. Welfare in the United States used to denote a specific program called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, which was abolished and replaced with something shorter term in the Clinton administration called TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. Legally, that's the only kind of welfare. In more popular usage, welfare is the kind of welfare that may be associated with black people. Food stamps are another such word. Legally, food stamps are not the same as welfare, but usually Americans love them. If you tell Americans that Social Security is a kind of welfare, they will yell at you. What do you mean it's welfare? I paid for it. And soup kitchen is specifically, I don't think it's racialized at all. It denotes poverty and charity, but again, not racialization. However, there are places where it is racialized. Stephen Smith would point out how on the LIRR, because the trains are priced for middle-class commuters, they're scheduled for middle-class commuters, so into the city in the morning, out of the city in the afternoon. I don't know if I think at this point they have a little bit of reverse peak service because they opened the third track, but for the longest time they had 2 tracks and they ran them one way, 1 track local, 1 express. Or rather, 2 tracks express, one of them also has local trains or something like that. They had very little local service. It's designed mostly for interfacing with park and rides. So they expect you to have a car, to be a 9-to-5er working in Manhattan. Yeah, basically Don Draper. Pete Campbell. Someone like that. And so the trains would be full going into Manhattan in the morning, and then the few trains that would run in service reverse peak would still be empty. I mean, that's why they're not running more, because they don't think in terms of frequency as good in itself. They only think in terms of capacity. And meanwhile, the buses between Queens and Long Island have the exact opposite valence. They're empty going into the city because people who live on the North Shore are rich and own cars. Why would they ever take the train into anywhere that's not Manhattan, let alone a bus? Even the South Shore. The South Shore is not as wealthy, but people who live here can afford a car. They're not going to ride a bus that offers terrible service into Jamaica or Flushing. So who rides these buses? It's working class New Yorkers doing service jobs on Long Island. So white people trains, empty trains. black people buses empty buses. It's literally that racialized. On Long Island, it's also often racialized so this is just suburbia, it's just suburban jobs. It's often racialized in secondary cities. I think New Haven has a pretty black bus ridership. Philly, in Philadelphia, off-peak, on the off-peak trams in West Philly, I was the only white person on a full tram, on a full streetcar. Peak, if I took the subway, again, West Philly, it was overwhelmingly black. I was one of a few white people on a full, like, more than standing room only subway car. But again, that's just West Philly demographics to some extent. Again, I emphasize, to some extent. And so the issue is partly because of racialization that leads to a lot of racism against any notion of integration. But even when it's not racialized, like in New England, I mean, there are just not enough black people in a place like Framingham or Worcester or Lowell for that to matter very much in planning. But people still talk about how to keep them separate. In the Boston area, it's illegal to plan the commuter trains, and I don't know if all buses or just the buses are not MBTA. So MBTA buses, different buses. I think even MBTA. So in Newton, so that's a pretty wealthy area. But the buses, I mean, what do you mean wealthy? It doesn't mean that people who use the buses are wealthy, because the wealthy people own cars. So who uses the bus? Probably people who can't afford a car, so they're going to jobs in Newton, or Watertown or Waltham, and so. But planning the buses in conjunction with the trains is actually illegal. So it's actually, I mean, not illegal in the sense that if they would need a very difficult to change law, but they would need to change something about the definition of what the MBTA should be doing in order to make it possible to redo the buses to feed the trains, for example, if the trains get better. And the same, and in the secondary cities, the ones that are run not by the MBTA but the RTAs, the regional transit authorities, like in Worcester and Framingham, they could make some of the buses run half hourly. I think Worcester there's I remember there was a corridor where I was planning to take the bus because I saw that it was running every 15 minutes because it was two bus lines running every half hour, and they were interpolated on the shared corridor. Maybe this one, I don't remember, to run every 15 minutes was 11 years ago. And when I mentioned this to my hosts, one of them immediately offered to give me a ride. I mean, they were not especially wealthy people, but I mean, college graduates in 2012 Worcester's, in 2012 Worcester don't take the bus. They don't expect their peers to take the bus ever. And it's not even some kind of sneering. I mean, like, I did get better transportation because my host drove me to the store. But they could do a thing where the trains get to Worcester every half hour clock face, and then the buses hit Worcester and it's half hourly clock face. And that is something that they could do. But again, they would need to change how they think about planning, and this means taking trains that are currently only for the rich and buses that are currently only for the poor and designing them together as a system. And because one of these is transportation is not very good if you're not a 9-to-5er, but could be made better, and the other is a soup kitchen, which again could be improved. Literally, the way that it would be improved is to meld it with the train, because there isn't that much job concentration in downtown Worcester. Everywhere else, there's just not enough job density for the buses to be viable for anyone who can afford a car. But that's okay, because you can start building a more centralized job center, a more centralized city center in Worcester. How? By improving the trains to Boston, by using the fact that Boston is sufficiently large and sufficiently rich to exercise economic influence this far. Currently, it's a little more than an hour by train. The regional rail plan for Transit Matters would cut that to, I think under current timetable, it's 45 minutes. It might move by a couple of minutes in either direction, depending on current work that we're doing. And by current work, I believe there's a meeting about that in 3 hours, because meetings with Americans always respect my. I should say they always respect my sleep habits, but it's not like I respect my sleep habits, so I shouldn't blame other people. And so that would improve the buses, and over time this would lead Worcester to co-evolve, in which better transit service here from Boston, most importantly, but also from the rest of the city and its inner suburbs, lead some employers to locate here. I mean, I imagine the highest and best use right now of all these goddamn parking lots is to be replaced by condos for middle-class commuters to Boston, but then the condos would generate demand for supermarkets in the area, and then maybe small offices, maybe some politicians' offices, maybe some law offices, things like that. And over time, I mean, it's never going to be an independent metro area again. It's 2023, not 19. I don't want to say 1943, but I think by then Worcester was already in decline. New England's decline happened early, so 1873, let's say. But 2023 means that this is a viable secondary center to Boston, and so play with that. But it does mean understanding that there's a difference between coverage and ridership transit, and understanding also, and once you understand it, also means understanding why there's such reluctance to invest in making this nicer. Namely, this is, for all intents and purposes, a soup kitchen. It does not need to be reliable, because the people in charge here don't ever ride their own system. They don't care about the people who ride the system, except as maybe charity cases. So yeah, they do experiments on them. I know of there are a bunch of places in the United States that were buying battery electric buses, and a bunch were buying from Proterra early on. And the specific stories I heard were from Worcester, and from not Minneapolis, but a suburb of Minneapolis. The southern suburbs of Minneapolis. It's called Minnesota Valley. This area, MVTA. So this is actually this is an area where the bus is actually for rich people. It's buses. The buses work like American-style commuter rail, but buses. So rush hour commuters on the freeways to downtown Minneapolis. They bought Proterra electric buses, as did Worcester. The buses are non-functional when the temperature is below freezing. Minnesota. Is Transit Matters getting noticed by anyone important? Yes. But I cannot tell you how important, because I do not speak Washingtonian. So I cannot tell you whether the political actors who are involved in us, where they are on the food chain between someone who happens to be working for some politician or is a political activist, but is otherwise a rando, and someone with the ear of Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who may have even given a presentation to Joe Biden, who was attentive and asked interesting questions and is going to follow up with him. Again, I do not speak that language, and therefore I do not get the contextual cues. And so the point is that rich people here ride the bus. So because Minnesota very famously has very harsh winters, and the buses were completely non-functional when the winter was very cold, they decided not to continue with the experiment and not to use these buses, these battery electrics, because this is for people who expect their world to be reliable. In Worcester, the buses were also non-functional in a blizzard, much milder weather than in Minnesota, but still cold enough it was non-functional. And what happened? They still ran these electric buses. I don't think they did mass purchase, but they kept running them because the managers didn't care about that kind of reliability for them. Okay, we're learning to use the tech. We're innovating. It's so because they think of it as poor people to be done an experiment on, to be experimenting on. Anything that compromises the poor people only nature of these buses is a threat. And I don't mean it's a threat to the manager's existence. To the contrary, the managers might gain from integration because it gives them more to do, which means they might be hiring one more person. The person's job would be to coordinate with commuter train timetables. It also means that they would be noticed by Boston, where right now there's a lot of siloing in the planning between Boston and the RTAs. And this means that it's maybe harder for a manager at an RTA to get noticed and move up to being a manager at a larger agency. Whereas under integration, it would be easier. And it's actually a thing. Sometimes there's this mentality where small business is better than big business. But certainly for office workers in the brass, not even in the brass, even pretty junior ones, I've heard a lot of variations of the same thing from a bunch of millennials I know in the transit industry, where they're specifically, but maybe they start working for a small consultancy or for a small agency, but then because they do not think they have much of a career there, because you need a specific person who likes their job to retire, and they're only going to do that in 10 years, then they jump to larger outfits, larger agencies, or larger companies because they feel like they have more opportunities for career development there. So this is something that would help the managers, because the managers would also benefit from being able to get ahead. So this is not managers caring about their interests in lieu of those of the riders. The part where they kept running the buses in Worcester when they should have is such a thing, but the part where they look down on any planning integration, that's not. That's just maybe small-mindedness, or maybe just or even a wrong social mentality, where why are you compromising our soup kitchen by asking how this could be turned into a profitable restaurant? We're not trying to, or to a restaurant that still is going to get subsidies but looks like a profitable restaurant. Where our goal is not to make a profit. This is a social service. This is a very ingrained thing. And as soon as such a thing happens, so I do not know to what extent the character of Worcester is upheld by equity trolls and community groups. I don't know Worcester well enough for that. In Providence, it really isn't. There isn't much of a thing. In New Haven, maybe there is because of worse town gown issues than in Providence, Yale being bigger and richer than Brown. So I've seen the equity trolls more in neighborhoods of rich cities than in small cities, so I don't know to what extent equity trolls are a problem in a place like Worcester specifically, or even New Haven. But yeah, it does mean that you're going to need to build a bus network where we're going to piss off. Usually it's going to be retirees who do a lot of the equity trolling, so it's white retirees who think of themselves as the vanguard of some kind of social equity, or who are not and do not know anyone who is. And that is a problem when you have soup kitchen transit. Suddenly everyone treats it like a soup kitchen, where if you try to make it not a soup kitchen, they yell at you about changing the character of the system, or finding the one person or the one imaginary person, if literally there's no such person, who rides the bus at this meander where they're delaying everyone by 5 minutes to serve this one destination. And because there aren't a lot of riders, they're not very powerful. The riders who are desperately poor, also not very politically powerful. And so that makes it really hard to grow. And again, it's kind of the opposite problem of Germany, where it's not about poverty. It's the main correlate of riding a regional train in Germany is voting for the Green Party and holding a very specifically new left ideology about transportation. So these are people who can be heard. And in the United States, it's different. It's not about ideology. The equivalent of the people who I'm stereotyping as living in city center and voting green, live in college towns, are NIMBYs, say that their NIMBYism is fighting gentrification, and as evidence will point out the rising rents and falling black population in a city where they will blame the fact that 100 housing units have been built in their town of 50,000 in the last 5 years, and they will say, "Oh, look at how the developers are making money off 100." They will not ever say only about the 100 housing units. And the and so the so the upshot is that and these people drive everywhere. So it's a different kind of dynamic, but it's the same thing, that misunderstanding that transit that works as a ridership service is something that's very distinct from something that does not work for ridership, and then as cope is sold as coverage, except it has such little ridership that it's not meaningfully covered. Like, it's not meaningfully. I mean, if you're telling me that, okay, I can go 3 kilometers and it's going to take me 15 or 20 minutes and the bus is going to come every hour, that's not coverage. That's not coverage. I mean, I can walk. I mean, I can't walk 3 kilometers in 20 minutes, but I walk 3 kilometers in half an hour, which means that most times of the hour, if the bus is hourly and takes 15 minutes, it's better for me to walk than to take the bus, which is still ridiculous. That's not coverage. That's cope. Oh, I have no idea why my voice just... I don't think there's been... Is my voice still echoey, the court? Sorry. This preview keeps buffering. Is video buffering yet? Oh, it fixed itself. Okay, good. What's the low latency mode they're telling me to get rid of? We'll deal with it later. Anyway, are there questions before we break? This is back to a stream taking between an hour and a half and a little more than 2 hours, not however long it takes me to finish a StarCraft campaign. Last one was more than 5 hours because it was a very long one. And of course, the issue is probably most explosive in LA, where you have the bus riders union who, out of political accelerationism, want the system to stay a soup kitchen. And when there are glimpses of people who are not poor using the trains, even at still lower than average incomes, they yell that this is racist. Again, the people using the trains in LA, let alone the buses, are less white than LA at large. And again, as I said, in big cities and neighborhoods of big cities, you do get equity trolls. I don't know the situation in small towns, but yeah, absolutely you'll have that in LA, where any attempt to convert the coverage-centric character of the network to a ridership-centric one does get a lot of political pushback. And yeah, the bus rider union is run by Maoists who are doing what they're doing for the accelerationist purpose of creating more conflict in the United States. Out of the theory that the United States can never be fixed, and therefore they should make a statement for their imagined third world audience. But, I mean, there are morons everywhere. The question is why in LA transit advocacy comprises proportionately more such morons than in a place like New York. New York does not lack left-wing people, radically left-wing people. Neither does San Francisco. And yet, in noticeably less left-wing LA, such a thing exists. This is the big problem with what covered services do, and the difficulty of getting them to become something better. Anyway, I'm gonna take one last minute call for questions, and if not, then we can break. It'll be an hour 55 of video. Of recorded video. And I can't tell what the latency is because I can't tell because of the buffering. No, that's enough. Anyway, so thank you all for watching. Thank you for bearing with me after a week of not transit. I don't think I'm gonna vlog on Saturday because I'm still reeling from the last week, but I am likely to go back to this in a week. So thank you all for watching. Thank you all for participating in chat, and I will see you in a week or on Mastodon or my blog or my Blue Sky. So thank you, and ciao ciao.